Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching today. My name is Jack Light. I'm with the Roosevelt Group's academic events team, and it's my honor to welcome Dr. Iain McGilchrist to join me today. Dr. McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, a neuroscience researcher, a philosopher, and a literary scholar who lives on the Isle of Skye. He's a Quondam Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, an Associate Fellow of Green Templeton College, Oxford, and a former consultant psychiatrist and clinical director at the Bethlehem Royal and Maudsley Hospital in London. He's been a research fellow in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins Hospital and a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Stellenbosch. He's published articles and research papers on topics in literature, philosophy, medicine, and psychiatry. He's the author of several books, including The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, and most recently, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. And it's a great honor to have him on. So Dr. McGilchrist, thank you for joining. It's great to see you.
Oh, thanks very much, Jack. Good to be here.
So just as a start, I think people who watch this will have kind of varying levels of familiarity with who you are and your work. And I think your
Of
your
course,
latest book is long, I think would be a fair way to put
it
it. So
is.
I think to
Yes.
begin, perhaps you could just briefly outline some of the questions that motivated you to write the book, and some of the methods that you've used to answer those questions, and outline perhaps like the hemisphere hypothesis that have come out of this work.
Yes, I mean, the first thing to say whenever I talk about my work is that you must put out of your mind anything you have heard about the hemisphere differences, because unless you've read me, they will almost certainly be quite wrong. Also wrong will be the idea that the whole topic has been rubbished and that it's all pop psychology. What is, largely speaking, not accurate and passed into pop psychology is all the stuff that I'm saying you need to forget. But there remains interesting questions. Why is the brain divided at all? A question that was never raised in my medical training. Why should the brain, which depends on connections for its power, have a massive disconnection right down the middle? Why is the brain asymmetrical? If it needed more size, more volume, it could do that symmetrically, but it hasn't. And why is the function of the corpus callosum, the main band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres at their base, why is it largely involved in inhibition? One hemisphere certainly passing information to the other, but very often saying, you keep out of this, I'm handling it. So those are important questions, and they've interested me for about 30 years. For various reasons, which lead from neuroscience into philosophy. Because if the brain has two hemispheres and they do different things, in what way are they different? And what consequences does that have for living human beings? To cut a long story short, my hypothesis is, and I don't know of any other alternative hypothesis that explains as much, my hypothesis is that the brain has evolved in this bipartite way for evolutionary, very important reasons to do with survival. Because, of course, it's not just human beings that have divided brains. All the animals, all the fish, the birds, the insects that we've looked at that have divided neuronal masses, and that have a neuronal mass at all, it is divided in this way. So it's a fundamental thing. And in fact, the most ancient neural network that we know, which is 700 million years old, that of Nematostella vectensis, a sea anemone, is already asymmetrical. So something very important here. And so despite being discouraged by kind colleagues who said, look, you've got a promising career ahead of you. Don't go into hemisphere differences. It's a certain career death. I decided that it was much too important to neglect. And I began to look into researches of my own and the researches of others and see that there are, in fact, fantastically important differences. They're not in what the two halves do, which is what people used to say. So, people used to say, well, the left hemisphere does reason and language, and the right hemisphere does emotion and pictures. This is unfortunately quite wrong, and it's one of the reasons that people became so discouraged they gave up looking, because they found the more they researched that each hemisphere is involved in everything. So both are involved in reason, in language, in emotion, and in visuospatial things. So what is the difference? The answer is it's not about what it does as if it was a machine, but how it does it as if it were part of a person. So in what way does it do it? And with what values does it do it? And why I say values here, it may sound an odd thing for a scientist to bring in fairly early on, but I think that's because we have a very peculiarly narrow view of what science is about. We are, after all, dealing with living things, and they do have values, even if they're just to eat. So what these two hemispheres evolved to do is to enable a creature to get what it needs to survive without itself being got. So if you imagine a bird that has to pick up a seed against a background of grit or pebbles very quickly, very accurately, it needs to do that in order to live. It needs to be able to pick up twigs and build a nest. All of these are important utilities for that creature. It must not only exhibit the kind of attention that will enable it to do that, committed attention to a goal, very narrowly focused on its target, very detailed. Because if it is only paying that kind of attention, it will miss everything else that's going on at the same time. In other words, the predator overhead, the conspecific at its side that also needs to be fed, and so forth. So we can't get by with one neuronal mass disposed towards the world. We need to have two, one disposed with this very narrow attention to a detail we already know we want in order to get it, and another kind of attention which is broad, open, sustained, vigilant, and uncommitted as to what it may find in order to keep the whole picture. So that's the hemisphere hypothesis in brief, but it leads to various consequences that are very important. So if you pay narrow attention to details, the first thing that happens is you see the world as composed of details, of fragments, and they're not apparently connected. They only get connected by you when you say, oh, I think I can put that with that. So it produces a picture of the world made up of little atomistic elements that are static so that you can grab them and get hold of them, frozen in time and space, disconnected from context, disembodied and abstract, examples of general things in the environment like a worm, I need that worm, a seed, I need that seed, a rabbit, I must catch that rabbit. But it's not able to see the uniqueness of the individual element that is in front of it, because the uniqueness isn't important when you're grabbing. So the left hemisphere is manipulating things that are isolated, static, inanimate, meaningless, and disconnected from their context. At the same time, the right hemisphere is seeing a world in which everything is interconnected ultimately with everything else. Nothing is ever static because it's always connected and it's flowing. So that network of whatever it is that exists is a constantly changing and flowing one, not a static one. It's also embodied. So the sense is of something that has an instantiation in the world, not just an abstract idea that can be put into a category. And so this builds up two kinds of worlds. One of them more or less like a bureaucrat's dream of things that are regular, orderly, belong in little boxes, are static, do as they're told, don't move, and have actually no meaning. And another world in which everything is potentially meaningful because it's interconnected with everything else, including ourselves, and in which context is extraordinarily important. So that is really the picture that I put forward in The Master and His Emissary, at least in the first part of the book. And I explained some of the philosophical consequences of having these two visions. And in the second half of that book, I looked at how this has played out over the history of the West, because it's my belief that at the moment, the take of the left hemisphere is so dominant that we don't see what the right hemisphere can tell us. And I look back over the history of the West from the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, 6th century BC, through to modernism, postmodernism, and looked at the various turning points in the history of ideas through the lens of this hemisphere hypothesis. And so I can come to say a little bit about The Matter with Things, which is the book that you referred to that was published a year ago, a little over now. Amusingly, it started off because people said the master in his hemisphere is full of fascinating ideas. These should be widely known, but they're in a 600-page book. You ought to write a much briefer, more accessible book. So I thought, well, okay, I'll start doing that. And as soon as I started doing it, I thought, why am I wasting my time doing this? I'm substituting for something that I explained subtly and at length, something crude and brief that will be supplanting the real work, because it'll be the one people will go to read. So I thought, I don't want to do this. But meanwhile, what I do really, really want to do before I die, and I'm getting on a bit, so I can't muck about too much, which is, if it's true that the two hemispheres attend to the world in quite different ways, and that is quite established conventional science, no neurologist in the world will dispute that. And if, as no philosopher would dispute, attention changes the world, changes what you find. If you attend in one way, you see one thing. If you attend in another, you see another thing. Then surely these two hemispheres are bringing into being for us two different phenomenological worlds. And our aim, the aim of all intellectual life, of philosophy and of science really, is to try and discern what really is. What is the nature of reality? Who are we? What is the world? How do we relate? These are incredibly important questions, particularly for right now. And so I thought, well, I will explore these two things, and we can talk about what I found if you like, but perhaps I'll leave it there at the moment.
Right. No, that's wonderful. Thank you. And I think one thing that really sort of clarified some of the points you made, especially in The Master and His Emissary, is you talk about, sort of the left and right modes of understanding as either building up from small pieces or from kind of understanding things as a whole in their context. And there are pictures that you've also referenced where you can see this so clearly. Two examples that come to mind are a picture that could either be seen as a candlestick or some kind of vase, or like two people looking at each other. Or there's another one of like a dog that's under a tree, but it's painted in such a way where it's just a couple little dots. So if you look at it too closely, you won't see anything. And then kind of there's a moment where you turn a corner and then you realize that it's actually like a full created scene in a picture. So it kind of, when you see that and understand it, you realize that that is actually how you think. A lot of the time, how you come to a lot of your conclusions is seeing something in its whole context for the first time
Yes.
and having a full understanding. You do not build things up the way you sometimes think that you do from small parts. So
Yes,
something that,
when you
oh, no, I'm sorry, please continue.
no, just gloss that for a second. When you reflect on what you do, you're using your left hemisphere consciously to examine what you do, and it works always serially, like, one step at a time. Let's pin down this. Oh yes, that's a bit of a dog. That's a bit of shade. Which of course doesn't work at all. In fact, you don't build up a picture from little details. That's just the left hemisphere, when it's talking about what we do, thinks that's what we do. What actually happens is we see the whole picture, and then our attention is grabbed by a detail in it. So we don't walk into our living room and go, oh, a TV, a sofa, a light. It's my living room. You go in, it's your living room. You see the whole thing, and then some detail in it grabs your attention. Anyway, over to you. And the thing is that when you see that, the picture as a whole, it's what psychologists, being an imaginative bunch, call the aha moment. The aha moment is very clearly related to the right superior temporal gyrus and sulcus.
Oh, that's very interesting. So something that I kind of kept coming back to as I was reading your work, and something that I think is kind of a theme of the conversation we'll have, is that this seems like your message would be very appealing and sort of universally appealing to young people, especially people who are kind of on the cusp of adulthood, because as they, begin careers, begin their adult lives, they almost view it as like a fresh start. It's like jumping into a pool. So it seems like your argument, which is not so much arguing for one single thing, but more of kind of a stance of engagement with the world, and one that sort of argues for being fully contextual, would be very, very kind of appealing. So have you had any kind of special reaction that you've noticed from young people to your work.
What pleases me is that people of all ages do gravitate to my work, do write to me saying this has, changed the way I think, it's changed my life, which is wonderful. It's a great gift and an honor. But and when I go and talk in public, often young people come up to me afterwards and say, "This is fascinating. What can we do about this?" Which is, of course, a pressing question and a hard one to answer in terms of bullet points, but certainly envisioning what a human being is, what the world is, and how we relate seems to be the important part of this. At the moment, there's a tendency for us to see nature as a heap of resource for our exploitation. We've come to see a society, instead of being a living, seamless web, as a bunch of atomistic individuals vying with one another for products and for status, whereas in fact, this is no way for humans to flourish. They are part of a society which helps make them, and they need to give back to that society. And it's through that interestingly, they come to flourish. It's through that belonging to a connective society, a stable society with its own values and rituals and solidity, and having something to do with the natural world, spending time in the natural world. And the third thing is having some relation with the spiritual realm, that we know from research are the three most important things for human flourishing in terms of both mental flourishing and physical flourishing and the moral flourishing of a society. So it's terribly important. And I think young people are fed up with the tired old vision that is put forward by many of the loudmouthed voices of the scientific world, which is that it was all a meaningless jumble of bits of matter that bump into one another, and that's all that really exists. The title, "The Matter with Things," is a pun, of course, because there's something wrong, and young people see that. But I'm suggesting that part of it is because we've decided that the only thing that exists is mere matter, and that things are what it's all about, whereas in fact, I argue it's about relationships. And indeed, I hope this will intrigue people more than put them off. I argue that relationships are prior to relata, to the things that are related. Now, in the normal way we think, that doesn't make any sense. How can there be relationships until the things that are to be related are there? But actually, that's a mistake, because the things that we call the things only come into being through their relationships. They only are what they are because of the relations they stand in. So it's a difficult one to unpack very briefly, but I just throw it out there. So what I'm really doing in that book is doing something that I think should appeal, and does appeal, as far as I can tell, very much to the young as well as to the old people like me, which is that there's much more to the world than this idea of reductive materialism. I mean, we all know intuitively, we know from experience, unless we allow our education to drown it out, that, there is nothing really there. But there's something beautiful, vibrant, complex, alive. And it's up to us to contact it, to honor it, to resonate with it. Because one of my themes is that the world is not a static entity that is just there like a passive thing to be registered on a photographic plate or recorded by a recorder. The world is only given as we encounter it. We can only know the world as we encounter it, and the way in which we encounter it changes what we find. This is so important. So having the right way to encounter the world, which is not the grasping, utilitarian, manipulative way, but an open, receptive, honoring kind of way, creates a world which suddenly is alive and beautiful for us, instead of the miserable world of fatalistic reductionism, which is what we are being sold.
Yes, sir. Yeah, and going back to your point about relationships being sort of prior to the parts, I think music is kind of the perfect example of that, because it's such a beautiful art form, um, and it really does kind of move and transform you. But also, a musical note is really nothing in a piece of music without the notes that come right before and after. So it's kind of the perfect example of context being everything. And then second, You were mentioning sort of the three most important things for people to do for mental and physical well-being, and I've also seen some of the research you talked about with spending time outside. Can you kind of gloss over that a little more thoroughly, just because I think it's important for everyone to know?
Yes, well, at the end of the Master in his Hemisphere, I went into the research about having a stable society and how important that is. But at the end of the Matter with Things, I look at these two other things in some greater detail. Spending time in nature, in relation with nature, and the spiritual, being in touch with a spiritual way of looking at the world, preferably belonging to a traditional one, but at any rate, at least allowing oneself space where there is room for such a view to be accommodated. And what we find on the particular point of spending time in nature is that even spending half an hour a day in a natural setting, actually attending to it rather than looking at your iPhone or your whatever it is that you're carrying, but actually being present, being mindful, smelling the smells, seeing the sights, feeling the air, being there, and having no preconceptions about it. This is very healing. And children who are brought up in a wholly urban environment, if taken out into nature for periods, become very, if you like, stimulated in a good way, not in a sort of a hyper way, by a sense of vitality, and it helps calm those that are anxious, the general aggressive, anxious and angry mode that so much of our intense modern urban Western existence takes place. All of this is healed by being there in the presence of nature. It also improves cognitive function, so that in fact we need these things for every part of us. And interestingly, it also improves one's physical health. Staggeringly, being a part of a stable social structure and being somebody who is engaged spiritually with the world, both of these are as important for one's physical health, like one's liability to certain kinds of disease. They're as important as going to the gym 3 times a week, losing weight, and stopping smoking. I mean, their effects are extraordinary. Now, I mean, of course, the point is that we shouldn't embrace these things because, oh, then I don't need to go to the gym and I'll be fitter physically. That's a very diminished, reductive way of thinking altogether. But it's that it enables us to flourish as a human being and to see all the things that we don't see because we're so sure we now know it all. In psychology, there's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is basically that the less you know, the more you think you know. And the more you think you know, the less you think you know. Unfortunately, a lot of the people who espouse this very materialist reductionist position, which is so simple to articulate, it's money for old rope to say this is how the world is. They think they know everything, but in fact, they know very, very little. And when you begin to explore, you realize how very little we do know. William James, the American psychologist and philosopher, who's one of my most admired intellectual influences, said, our ignorance is an ocean, our knowledge is a drop. And that's about where we need to realize again where we stand. We don't know it all.
I'd like to circle back, and I think this also ties into what you were just talking about kind of the reaction that you were getting for young people, and they would write and say that you've kind of changed the way that they've been thinking about things, because it seems like the way the young people today go about getting their worldview and piecing it together is very kind of susceptible to falling into patterns of thinking that defer to the left hemisphere over the right. Because I think it's a lot more now about public debate and sort of online activity and engagement. That's how a lot of people sort of go about getting their worldview now. And particularly as you go into university and higher levels of education, it seems there's more of an emphasis on very tight analysis of very kind of niche pieces of literature and fields. And one of the quotations of yours that you cite in your book that's really stuck with me is Erwin Chargaff, who sort of described what he called the overfragmentation of academia, and described it, I think he said, a Humpty Dumpty world, because you were sort of ripping pieces away from it and analyzing them in a very sterile academic context and then never really inserting them back into the contextual whole. And I think that probably resonates a lot with a lot of students today. I know I can even pick up on some of it in the field I study, international relations, where there are various theoretical outlooks that inform how practitioners view the world. And those theoretical outlooks are slowly becoming less and less compatible, and there's less intercommunication between the two. And that's very different, I think, from how people historically have gotten their worldview. It was much more about their local community, their family, their religious beliefs. I think drama probably had a bit more to do with how people would formulate their worldview. And I think, along with the religion and the drama, I think metaphor was a much more important component in how people would, sort of fundamentally think. And it was all very embodied because you were learning from people who you lived with every day and kind of spent all of your life with. So there are definitely pros and cons to both. It seems like, obviously people now have a much more diverse sampling of world history and knowledge. But when you step away from that kind of embodied, holistic, fluid learning experience that people have historically used, I think you lose something too. Do you think, is that kind of a fair way to characterize the relationship between those two? And what are your thoughts about the trade-offs that come with it?
Yes. Well, you're quite right that both ways of looking at the world, if one can talk in such very general terms, both seeing the connections and seeing where the parts fit into the whole and paying attention to minutiae, details, are important. And I'd like to think that my work is, in fact, a good example of being able to harmonize these things, because it's based on an incredible amount of very detailed analytical research. People often say to me, but your work is very left hemisphere, isn't it? Well, I say, well, I wouldn't write a better book if I didn't have a left hemisphere. I wouldn't be more intelligent or insightful if I had my left hemisphere removed. I hope it's working well. The important thing is it should always be playing second fiddle to the right hemisphere, because the left hemisphere doesn't really know what it's talking about. It sees only a bit, and it works on that. And although I tend to dislike the image of the brain as a computer, well, that's putting it mildly. And in the book, I talk a bit about the many ways in which the brain is nothing like a computer. Nonetheless, one way of thinking about it is that the right hemisphere is the one that first appreciates experience. It then sends stuff to the left hemisphere where it's compartmentalized and, if you like, administered and bureaucratized. And then that needs to be taken back into the right hemisphere to be put into the whole picture where alone it makes sense. But the left hemisphere is slightly like a personal computer, in which the right hemisphere has a rich take on experience. It then allows the left hemisphere to break this up, fragment it, analyze it, categorize it. And that the computer that can do these procedures very rapidly doesn't understand what it's doing. It simply does them because it's told that that's what it's to do, as it were. And then it spews out data, and the data only means something to the right hemisphere, if you like, once it's taken back into the whole picture. So I quote Einstein's remark, purported at any rate, but it's very much in his spirit if he didn't say it, that the rational mind is a faithful servant and the intuitive mind is a precious gift. We live in a world that honors the servant but has forgotten the gift. And in his work, and I know quite a lot about his writings and research, I've read pretty much all of it, he is very clear that his results came to him intuitively through forms and shapes, which is actually, if you read the history of the discoveries of great scientists and mathematicians, it's almost invariably the case. They don't make them by plodding in a linear way. They do a certain amount of that, they have to do that, but then it's actually when they're not thinking about it that something comes as an aha moment and is an illumination which gives them their insight. So we need both of these, but the way our education is set up is very much siloed into, this and that and the other. And of course, if you, as you say, if you diversify, you need to be careful not to make it very superficial, because there is a sort of trade-off between knowing a lot about, say, your own cultural history and trying to know a lot about every cultural history and knowing very little about any of them except the cliches that you've picked up. So we need to trade off breadth against depth. Um, or depth is an unfortunate word because it makes it sound like there's something deeper about the detailed analysis. There isn't. The depth comes with the breadth, actually. But nonetheless, we need both of these takes on the world. And at the moment, the way in which we think tends to be very compartmentalized, very polarized, very black and white, misses all that is implicit, which includes the things you mentioned, like metaphors, myths, stories, narratives, poetry, humor, music, religious things. All these things, when they're turned into sort of bald statements, become absurd and lose their power. Trying to explain a poem is like trying to explain a joke. It makes it fall flat. And indeed, religious texts are like this. Once you put them on the par with a manual that helps you repair the lawnmower, you completely misunderstand what is in that religious text. It's not intended to be taken in that way. So we've lost this implicit, intuitive way of thinking, and that has not made us happier or more intelligent. In fact, it has made us much less intelligent. One of the things I ought to say, which is very important and not enough widely enough known, is that the right hemisphere, I'm sure a lot of people would accept, has more emotional and social intelligence. It understands what utterances of other human beings mean. It understands what may be going on in their mind. It understands tone of voice, facial expression, body language, all the stuff that is non-explicit. But it's also much more important for good old-fashioned cognitive intelligence. So IQ. So if you measure the IQ of people, and then they later have a stroke, and you measure the IQ again, in those cases where there's a significant drop in IQ following the stroke, it is almost entirely because of damage to the right hemisphere, hardly ever to damage to the left. That is really interesting because it runs completely counter to the idea that the pop psychology idea. And also, I'd just like to say the other pop psychology idea that's completely crazy is that the left hemisphere may be boring, but is at least reliable. It's unemotional and dependable, like a rather dull accountant. But actually, it isn't. It's not more dependable. It's actually, frankly, on its own, deluded. I mean, I'm not saying that in a casual way. I'm literally saying it is prone to delusions in a technical sense when it tries to assess the world on its own. And I believe we are, that's why the subtitle of this book is Our Delusions. I think we're deluded about the nature of reality. And I think we're unmaking the world by fragmenting it and robbing it of its meaning. We think that meaning is something we paint on to the world. We invent meaning because we're meaning-seeking individuals. But I'd like to put it a quite different way. We don't invent meaning, we discover meaning that is there for the discovery. And we can live our lives without discovering it. And that is a waste of a life. It is our role to be responsive to what is, to its beauty, to its complexity. And once you realize that, then meaning is reconceived in one's mind. It's not a question, what does all this mean? Because it automatically conveys its meaning in itself.
I think right along with a lot of the stuff you just talked about, with the relationship between the right hemisphere and intelligence and kind of finding the balance between breadth and depth, um, is I think just the fact that you wrote such a long book in itself. Because when I was reading it, I was like, this is really difficult. And not difficult because like the actual words were hard to understand, but when you read a book, you sort of have to train your mind to follow an argument for a really long period of time. You can't really, sort of copy paste anything the way you would when you read, like a shorter news article or a social media post. So I think that the process of reading something that long and that thought out kind of encourages you to seek that balance of both breadth and depth, and appreciate it in a different way. Um,
Yes, and I think it's worth just commenting on attention there, because one of the things that happens with our technological world and the world of social media above all is that our attention is constantly distracted by things that pop up on a screen or a little sound that tells us there's a message or whatever. And this fragmentary attention is the cause of the fragmentary vision of the world we have. In order to see the world as a whole, we need to be able to pay long periods of sustained, deep attention. And training in mindfulness is one way of helping us overcome this fragmentation of attention. But in our academic studies, in understanding what we're dealing with, we need to be able to sustain long periods of thought, of pondering, of contemplation on certain ideas. And I suppose that what I hope, and I'm glad you did say that it wasn't that the words are difficult, I have one of the reasons I find writing takes a long time is that I really try very hard neither to patronize the reader by talking down to them, nor to expect that they will automatically understand terms in philosophy and neuroscience. So I try to explain things in a way where I put myself into the shoes of somebody approaching this for the first time. What would I need to help me see this? So yeah, but it does require a bit of yes, focused attention and sustained attention at the same time. Yeah.
um, when you were sort of starting out your career and beginning your studying and your writing, were you sort of aware of this kind of necessity for breadth and depth of knowledge, or was that something that evolved more naturally as you kept going on? How has it kind of shaped your work?
Well, it's a good question. And I think the answer is that I always had an inkling that this was important, but it's been demonstrated more and more with living and with the fact that I have all my life, my main love has been philosophy. But I've also studied literature and, of course, medicine and um, neuropsychology and so forth. So I have a quite broad base to draw on, but I was aided in that by two things. One was the way I was taught at school, which was not to a very tramlined curriculum. Like it's, today is whatever it is, the 23rd of January 2023. So we're on page 147 and it's exercise 12. That wasn't the way we were taught. We were taught in a much more free way, which I think we need to do something about reestablishing, which is it really only works if teachers teach you about what inspires them and about their vision of things. And of course, certain things have to be covered. I'm well aware of that. So there has to be, in the end, an ability to cover a lot of ground and cover all the essentials. But I think over-controlling, micro-controlling teachers, like micro-controlling doctors, is a very bad idea. And it's part of this paranoid view of the left hemisphere, which needs to control everything. And this is anti-creative. So, across the board, people are in fact becoming less able to come up with interesting original solutions than they were in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of the last century, when people were, told, go off, investigate this, and, we won't keep harassing you for results until you've got some. But nowadays, you've got to say ahead of time, before you've even done the experiment, what the point of the experiment is and what it is you expect to discover. But that's a very bad way to produce a society that is genuinely creative and able to bring new things to bear on its vision. And the second thing that happened for me was that apart from a very broad education in which, in fact, I moved at a certain age, we were supposed to specialize in either the classics, i.e. Latin and Greek, and the ancient world, science, or the humanities, mainly that being languages and history. And I moved between all three of these in a rather erratic way. And then at Oxford, after I got my degree, I was elected to a fellowship at a college called All Souls College, which has no students at all. It has no undergraduates, no graduates, no nothing. There are only fellows. And if you like, it is a kind of think tank, really, although it should be much more than that and was much more than that. And I won a kind of fellowship which enabled me to have 7 years in which I could do what I like. And I was going to pursue a narrow doctorate, but people said to me, no, don't do that. You can always do that. Anybody can do that. But what you've got here is a gift that nobody else will have, which is 7 years in which you can do what you like. You can explore science. You can explore philosophy. You can explore history. I actually found myself a Russian tutor and, taught myself that. I explored into these areas to do with body and mind, which led me into the need to study medicine. So I was given the ability to do all this. And when I finished these 7 years, I thought, gosh, in retrospect, you could have done so much more. What have you got to show for it? But that was me falling into the mistake of, you've got to have a result now. We've got to crystallize what you're doing. Tell me what paper you've just written. Now, if somebody had said that, I'd have crystallized my thinking far too early. And really, my thinking started to crystallize only later when I was doing medicine. And I thought, all these things come together with my understanding of the brain. And so actually, I didn't waste that time. It was what issued in these two very long books that, that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you. Um, so I'd like to circle back a little bit towards sort of the university style of teaching now, kind of, I guess you could say like the idea of the marketplace of ideas, where you sort of put everything out to get challenged and subject it to rigorous analysis. Because I think there's obviously huge utility in that university students experience, and that probably you were able to experience in spades in your 7 years. But it also seems like more and more you run the risk of having your thoughts sort of atomized and taken out of context. And I think this leads back again into the technology question. So much of our interaction with each other being online. So do you think it's the case that there are some things like maybe a person's sense of spirituality that should just be kind of off limits for that kind of thinking? Or do you think it's something else entirely?
Well, I wouldn't like to say that any realm of self-exploration or the intellectual or spiritual life should be off limits. But I think instead we should be extraordinarily wary of debate on social media because by nature it's limited to brief utterances. And it feeds right into two important things about the left hemisphere, that it is impatient and wants to have it all wrapped up in a simple single idea. And it thinks very much in black and white terms. The right hemisphere is able to maintain two possibilities together without collapsing into one or the other. But the left hemisphere cannot do that. It can only compute, as it were, something that is either this or that. Unfortunately, everything that we experience is more than those either or categories would allow us to see. So I think debate on social media is more or less pointless unless you are part of a group of people who are going to listen and honor one another and contribute longer pieces, or part of a reading group where you can listen to one another's points of view. But the intolerance of any point of view is, to me, anathema and is against the academic spirit. We should be allowed to say what we like. If it's nonsense, it will soon be proved to be nonsense. But you shouldn't have to decide beforehand that certain things are nonsense before we've really explored them fully. So the whole spirit of the intellectual life demands honest exploration and not high-handed judgments, jumping to conclusions and shouting down your opponents. Instead, I think a more balanced and more reasonable approach is what's required. And I think we should be able to say anything at all as long as we say it in a reasonable way. Some people will say, well, there's no way in which you can say certain things. I don't altogether agree with that. It may be a complete waste of time saying such things, and they will probably declare themselves as a waste of time very quickly. But once you start telling people that you can't entertain a certain thought or you can't question a certain idea, you're in a tyranny. That was a point made by Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, I think, is enormously important thinker. She is so rich in insights that apply to our society now, although she was writing about encroaching totalitarianism in the 30s and 40s. But, we are in an era of encroaching totalitarianism now.
And I think what you were just talking about with, sort of being wary of debates on social media, and also what you were talking about in the last couple of minutes, kind of the changes in curriculum to be very, very standardized, and that everyone has to teach only the same thing. It strips away kind of the embodiment and the contextualization that the right hemisphere craves, because the people that you're talking to sort of are becoming widgets in a bin instead of fully alive people that are thinking and reflecting just the same as you are.
And it brings us back to relationships, because let me emphasize this. Teaching is a relationship. It's a relationship between the mind of the one who's teaching and the one that is being taught. And it's a reciprocal relationship. So, like all human things, it is reverberative. It evolves between individuals. Medicine is a relationship. It's not something where you feed your symptoms into a computer and it spews out some data. It's a relationship with a living person who is able to engage intelligently and empathically with what you are experiencing. We've lost this idea of relationship. Instead, we've got atomistic, inanimate entities. And the computer is, I'm afraid, the exportation of this way of thinking into the external world. If people are interested, I'm sorry I mentioned this because I think I really want people to engage with it, and I think young people would respond to it particularly. I was asked to give the opening talk at the World Summit of AI in Amsterdam in November just gone. And the talk is on the internet. It's only 25 minutes. And it is a distillation of my, of course, there's a hell of a lot more to say, but of my brief references to some of the dangers of this kind of thinking.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I certainly hope people go and watch that because I did watch it. It's wonderful. Would definitely recommend it to people.
Thank you. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to start winding up soon, but I would like to talk to you for a few
Okay.
minutes about
Yes.
the idea of fear, because it's something I've been thinking of a little. Because I think at first I was naturally thinking of it as being a mostly kind of right hemisphere driven phenomenon, because going back to the very first example you were talking about of the bird, the bird has the
Mm,
right hemisphere on the lookout to context and
mm,
for potential dangers, but then it seems like as soon as a danger is identified or anything kind of stands out of the context, especially if it triggers kind of like the startling reflex, if it actually triggers some kind of danger response, it seems like it would almost immediately become almost the province of the left hemisphere, because you kind of put all of your attention into the fight or flight question. Do I fight or do I go? So you stop thinking about any other kind of broader context and focus only on answering that one single question as quickly as possible. So my question is basically, I feel like there's sort of quite a lot of free floating anxiety floating around now. Not only because of obvious things like the pandemic, but also I think just kind of the pace at which people's daily lives are changing with the implementation of new technology, really ever since the Industrial Revolution. The way people live their lives has been changing so much and continues to accelerate. So, do you think that it's possible that because of this just free floating fear, people are more inclined to be shutting out the broader context and falling into these patterns where they're looking for corroborating information, which then drives them towards things like social media and the internet, which kind of creates a toxic feedback loop? Do you think that that's a fair way to phrase that?
I do. And I think that is part of the world we now live in. When people are anxious, feel rudderless, pointless, unsure that they have any agency that can change anything, and the world is described to them as meaningless, they become enormously fearful and long for somebody who will take control and reassure. And this is why people are drawn to simplistic black and white conclusions. Oh, it's all because of, I don't know, some particular social group or something that is the problem here. And it leads people, as I think is nicely explored by Matthias Desmet in a recent book on the roots of totalitarianism, that it leads people to vulnerability to a forceful individual who will lay down law and order. So I think that is a problem. There is a loop there, because the left hemisphere is anxious as soon as it's not in control. Its raison d'etre, if you like, is to get into control. Its one value is power, whereas the right hemisphere sees many values rather, other than power and utility. It sees things like beauty, truth, and goodness. It sees the importance of bravery and magnanimity and loyalty. It sees the importance of the sense of the sacred. All these things are not in the calculation of the left hemisphere, which is just about control. So when things seem out of control, people who are in this mindset become they have free-floating anxiety. Things seem out of control. What can I do about it? As a psychiatrist, of course, people used to often come to me and say, I feel my life's out of control. And without being flippant, I would say to them, well, join the club. We're not much in control of our lives from the moment we're born. We're not in control of where we're born, when we're born, to which parents we're born, how we're brought up, how tall we are, what intellect we have, what, color skin we have. These are all things that we are born with. And it's up to us then to not try rigidly to strive for certain things against the current, but to use the current to achieve things and to go with the flow, I'm afraid, to use a rather hackneyed expression, but it's very important. I mean, in other words, you have to surf the waves in life rather than stand up to the waves and go, no, you shall not move me. And then the wave crashes on you and smashes your head on a rock. So the other thing that's interesting is that the left hemisphere is literally constructed, its neuronal networks are constructed in a tighter, more self-referring way than those of the right hemisphere. So in the right hemisphere, there are much more broad-reaching open networks that interconnect. But in the left hemisphere, the tendency is to go ever more tightly into the same area. So you were a bit like the person who said, he's seen searching under a spotlight for his keys, and people say, well, where did you drop your keys? Over there. Well, why are you looking here? Well, that's because where the light is. So if you are anxious, the left hemisphere then gets ramped up because it's feeling, what do I do? And its answer is to go tighter and tighter into a knot. And we've all had this experience that when we try and strive all the time anxiously for something, it doesn't happen. And then when we relax about it, even if it's just remembering a name, it comes when we've relaxed. So it is very important. It's another aspect that is anti-creative. And I would say that neither hemisphere has a monopoly on fear. I mean, that would be too simple. Both hemispheres are capable, obviously, of feeling fear, of feeling anything, really. But if you look at psychiatric conditions, there is, as you probably know, because there's a whole chapter devoted to it, that left hemisphere overdrive and right hemisphere hypofunction is very much like the schizophrenic world. So people with schizophrenia seem to have an excessively left hemispheric way of looking at the world. People with depression, and there are many kinds of depression, so it's harder to generalize, but there is certainly a kind of depression which is much more like an exaggeration of the right hemisphere's way of looking at the world. Again, to know more about that, we haven't got time to go into it, but if people read, they'll find it. But anxiety can be either. But interestingly, in the early stages, what we call the prodrome of schizophrenia, it very often presents as free-floating anxiety, which of course does not mean I hasten to assure your audience that if you have free floating anxiety, that means you're becoming psychotic. No, it doesn't. It's a very common condition, and psychosis is less common. But I'm just saying that sometimes it is a warning sign that this person is drifting off into this very tightly, um, uh, essentially barren, sterile world of the left hemisphere.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, I think we've got probably time for just three more, hopefully shorter questions.
Yes,
The
sure,
one,
yeah.
yeah, the one was actually quite perfect because you were just talking about schizophrenia and that sort of chapter in your book. And this question was actually sent in by a friend of mine who was curious about this and asked, from like an experimental medical standpoint at present, is there a way to measure sort of on a spectrum, how as right hemisphere function decreases, the symptoms of these disorders like schizophrenia, I think autism would be another one. Is it possible to see as the power of the right hemisphere decreases relative to the left, these symptoms becoming more and more severe, or at present is it more of just like turning on a switch where either the right is suppressed or it's not?
It's not that the right is suppressed or it's not. Um, but I'm not quite sure what it is that you're asking me to talk about. But one of the things that is very clear is that if you compare the phenomena experienced by people with schizophrenia and their way of being in the world, and to some extent that of certainly a subset of people with autism, it's very like what happens when people have a clear brain lesion, which is stopping their right hemisphere from functioning. So, in that sense, you can match the picture of the person who has an obviously organically visible damage to the right hemisphere and compare it with that of the subject with schizophrenia or autism and say there are extraordinary parallels here. Um, I hasten to add that actually neither schizophrenia nor autism, particularly autism, can be summed up in such a simple way. And I say more about that again when I'm writing than I can say when I'm talking. The other thing is that yes, there are checklists and instruments that you can administer that supposedly show predominance or otherwise of one hemisphere or the other. But really all they're doing is, again, comparing the phenomena of the person against the phenomena of somebody with right or left hemisphere damage.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. And then, so next question. You cite at the very beginning of the second volume of your book an Iraqi legend about two deity
Yeah,
brothers,
yeah.
he who grasped the sky and
Mm,
flint, and the two sort of uncannily
mm,
portray some of the dynamics you've described between the right and the left hemisphere, because the one brother, he grasped the sky, is very aware of kind of his higher origin, whereas the other brother, Flint, representing the left, is not. And, the two creatures that they create, Flints are sort of strange and missing a kind of soul that has to be given by he grasped the sky. So it's really kind of bizarre how closely that legend mirrors
mm,
some of the things that you've written and also kind of the historical path that you've
mm,
painted with us
mm,
humans falling out of touch with sort of what makes the right hemisphere's view of the world so special, which must have been really bizarre for you to read when you were writing the book. So I was just wondering if you could talk about how you came across that story and at what process
mm.
in writing the book you were at and how it influenced the rest of the book.
Well, actually, I can tell you exactly how I came across it. An anthropologist called Stefano Fait wrote to me after reading The Master in His Hemisphere and said, there is this Iroquois legend. I think you might be interested. And that's the understatement of the year. I was utterly gobsmacked. And it for those who are interested, it's the opening of part 3 of the book. As you say, the second volume begins there, um, chapter 20. And there's about 6 pages in the printed book. It's worth referring to if you can. But the essential things to note are, well, the essential things are rather subtle, and they're to do with all those spiritual things you were talking about. But first of all, the one brother, the superior brother, that must be the one that is in overall charge of the lesser brother. Um, in his name is this idea of both hands, which is extraordinary, and heaven. Whereas flint, the other one, is it suggests hard heart, an arrowhead, because he says, I have this arrow my father gave me, and speech. Now, speech and this targeting with an arrow are, if you like, the summary of the strengths of the left hemisphere. This rectilinear attachment to prey, something you want to get, and language. Now, this was in the oral tradition of the Onondaga people, who are an Iroquois nation. Um, long before anybody knew anything about the differences between the hemispheres. So it can only be that they intuited this. And it is a marvelous myth because, I haven't got time to unpack it all, but every bit of it just goes, wow. But this is exactly the problem of the relationship between these two hemispheres. And the thing that I like about it is that obviously this has come from introspection. People have realized there are these two elements in their world, but that is also played out in the mythologies and wisdom traditions all around the world. So, for example, in the Chinese book of the Secret of the Golden Flower, which I think is 8th, 9th century, there is a text which, again, I quote in there about, effectively, I didn't know it at the time I chose the title The Master and His Hemisphere from my earlier book, but is about the emperor and a general who is supposed to be doing the bidding of the emperor, but becomes intemperate and arrogant, and therefore loses the way in which things unfold. And I've also found it in stories from all around the world, from the Poles, from, I don't mean people living in Poland, but in circumpolar regions, there are myths that are like this, and in the Indian tradition, there are myths that are like this. So it seems a common thing. In fact, we have the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which was brought to note by Goethe in the late 18th century in a poem, Der Zauberlehrling, the magician's pupil, in other words, the sorcerer's apprentice, which is this story of somebody who thinks they know it all and actually doesn't, and therefore gets into very deep water, literally in the story of the sorcerer's apprentice. So these are stories that resonate with everybody at all times and have been wonderfully unpacked, and they are the story that I'm telling of the neurological world, as well as the philosophical and spiritual world.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much. So interesting. I guess last question. So this most recent book was obviously a huge undertaking. Have you decided what's next, or do you have anything in the works?
Well, what's next for me is a long period of silence, I think, which would be probably very welcome for everyone, and particularly me. But I'd like to write a much shorter book. But then as I told you, my ambition was to write a shorter book when I wrote a much longer one. But I would like to write a shorter book without footnotes and without all the apparatus that explains why I say all these things. So I'm going to work on that. And another thing that I would really enjoy doing, because I have gathered over the years a lot of very interesting paintings by patients with schizophrenia. And I also was a consultant at the Bethlehem and Maudsley Hospital in London, where they have a museum. Bethlehem goes back to the 14th century, and they have a museum of works by former patients, which include some quite well-known figures, and their paintings are fascinating. So I would like to write what is probably an extended essay accompanied by a lot of these pictures with comments on how they illustrate my hypothesis. So that would be a nice and easy thing to do.
Yeah,
At
yeah,
the
would love
moment, I'm trying to read the audio book because people keep saying, "Oh, I'd love an audiobook." But can you imagine how long it's taking to read an audiobook? Because it takes one roughly 3 or 4 times as long to actually read it and read it aloud as it would do to read it to yourself. So, yeah.
Yeah, but will there be an audiobook coming out at any point?
Well, there
Yeah,
will, but I don't give any promises as to
yeah.
when. It's just that you have to keep fiddling around with the technical side and going, I've got to redo that, and so you end up repeating yourself many, many times in order to get it right. So.
All right. Well, sir, thank you. It's
Anyway, there
been
we are.
yes, sir. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. It was a great pleasure. A huge thank you to the Roosevelt Group for helping host this event, and making the recording publicly available on their website. And to everyone watching, if you're interested in looking into some more of Dr. McGilchrist's work, he's available on YouTube and on his website, Channel McGilchrist. And you can order both of his latest books, The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things, which are, goes without saying, recommended reading. So have a good evening, everyone. Dr. McGilchrist, thank you again.
Thanks very much, Jack. It's been a pleasure.